Hello, this is a video lecture on Chapter 4 of Discovering the Humanities, The Flowering of Religion, which covers the Byzantine Empire, early Christianity, and Islam. I'd first like to pause a moment and talk a little bit about Byzantine and Islamic art, painting, and architecture. One thing that you'll notice in Byzantine art is something called reverse perspective. So, without getting too mathematical, which would be dangerous because it's been a long time since I've had math class, let's look at some of the ways that you see perspective. On the left, you see linear perspective, and that's where the vanishing point is located inside the painting. When we get to the later medieval and Italian Renaissance paintings at the end of our course, you'll see that Western art starts to really use linear perspective. The middle is axonometric perspective. This is neutral point of view. Out of the space, the lines of the object remain parallel and bring it closer to the witness. So this may be the kind of perspective that we've been seeing in our art so far. Byzantine art, however, uses what's called reverse perspective, meaning that the vanishing point is located outside of the painting and sometimes even within the viewer of the piece of art. So here's a mosaic here from around 547 CE of Empress Theodora and her attendants in the Byzantine Empire. And you see this fountain in the bottom left. The last guy on the end is kind of holding back the curtain and showing you the fountain. The fountain seems to tip towards the viewer, and this is an example of reverse perspective. So the vanishing point is, again, the beholder's eye, not a point in the painting itself like in later art. It causes paintings to appear to tip towards the beholder, and it's meant to represent the imperfection of human vision. Unlike our later Renaissance painters that we'll see, there was not a big desire to make things look perfect or super hyper realistic, but instead to point out the imperfection and the limitations of human mind. Here's a modern painting that uses reverse perspective. So see how the walls of this art gallery on which the painter has painted other famous paintings kind of jump out and come towards you. This is an example of the vanishing point being with you, the viewer, instead of inside the painting itself. All right, besides using reverse perspective, Byzantine art is known for its icons. And you see an icon here of Mary and baby Jesus, although he doesn't look very babyish. Byzantine art, in terms of icons, involves sacred images of Christ, the saints, and scenes from the crucifixion. They could be portable, and some were actually carried into battle. Some of them, like this one that you see here, were frescoes or wall paintings. They were used as an aid to prayer. So here's some examples here of icons. You have on the left Jesus, and those words written in Greek have some meaning there. On the right, I think this is Peter, and the reason I know that is because you see him holding kind of like the Pope rod there. His fingers are in blessing, just like Christ's are, although Peter's are a little bit more rounded. And then down the side, you see the Greek letter pi there, which was for P, Petros, or Peter. And then at the bottom on the right-hand side, there is an icon of the angel guarding Jesus's tomb and Mary, and the other Mary coming to embalm Jesus's body on Easter morning. So those are some examples of icons. Islamic art, coming a little bit later, is a blending of Greco-Roman, Byzantine, and Iranian styles. There are 4 components to Islamic art that your book will tell you a little bit about, but I go into a little bit more depth here, just so you can start to really analyze it. Calligraphy, vegetal patterns, geometric patterns, and figural representation. So let's look at calligraphy first. Very beautiful calligraphy work in Islamic art, like you see here. It is the most highly regarded art form, at least in this time period. It's used as an ornament and a talisman. It is believed to draw good luck or God's favor. There are different styles of calligraphy for a time period, and I haven't been over there lately, or I would have told you this definitively. The Dallas Museum of Art had a whole little Islamic art section that was kind of off the main esplanade inside the DMA, where they would go into the 4 different types of calligraphy. Often the calligraphy is expressing the Bismillah, which is the first word of the sacred prayer, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, ever merciful. Vegetal patterns are also a big theme in Islamic art, as you see here. These are patterns of leaves, flowers, and fruit. They were influenced by existing Byzantine and Iranian art styles, and so we want to think of art as coming out of its context. And this was in style at the time that Islam was spreading in these areas. As time progressed, these vegetal patterns become more and more abstract. So instead of becoming more hyper-realistic, as Western art sometimes does, Islamic art was becoming more abstract as it progressed. I wanted to show you that this is not just painting or mosaics, but also 3-dimensional, as in the sculpture here around this building. And these are geometric patterns. Often you'll find these beautiful geometric patterns on Islamic buildings. Again, we see some Greco-Roman and Iranian influence on the designs. What happened was Islamic artists would take kind of a base, you see the arch here, and then they would elaborate on it, add their own spin, make it even more extra, if you will, on this gorgeously sculpted building. Often geometric patterns coexist with calligraphy. All right, and then we have figural representation. Now, it is a common misconception that Islamic art never features people, and this is not true, as you see some here. Now, we would not find this on a holy building. Allah is seen as the image maker, and men are warned not to breathe life into their artwork, which may be a big reason why the art progressively gets more and more abstract. The forms in Islamic art that represent figures are stylized and not naturalistic. Figures are allowed as illustrations for books, especially books of history. I have a link here if you want to look at the Hagia Sophia. This is a very interesting building, an example of what we call syncretism, which is a big theme in your book and one that I would like to emphasize too. I'm not going to play it here just because I might get a little ping from the YouTube copyright folks, but I will also link this separately. The Hagia Sophia began life as a holy church in the city of Constantinople. But then after the Islamic invasion of 1492, it became a mosque. And so it's very interesting. And the preservation at the Hagia Sophia, or holy wisdom is what this means, is it has to fight itself almost. Maybe not fight is the right word, but it has to take in consideration that this building has such a long history. What parts are you going to preserve? Because people over the centuries have painted on top or overlaid mosaics on top of earlier works. So it's just a very interesting kind of art ethical issue. So I'll link that separately. Okay, you guys are not going to take the architecture quiz, obviously, because we're not together. But if we were, I would have paused here and kind of talked to you guys a little bit, reviewed your architecture. So I'm just going to walk you through it here. If you want to play along, go ahead, number your paper 1 to 5, and try to determine which civilization created the architectural work. And we're going to limit ourselves with Egyptian, going forward through Greek, Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic. Okay, so number one, we see here an aqueduct. We see lots of arches. And this is a big clue that this is a Roman structure. Romans were masters of the arch, and the arch still is rounded here. If it was a little bit pointed, we might make the argument that this is an Islamic built structure, but this is actually Roman. Okay, so this is similar to what you might see on a midterm, hint, hint. All right, number two, we have a temple here. And as you hopefully know from doing your Greek architecture activity, this is a Doric temple. We know this because of the really massive style, the very plain columns there that don't have any fluting. And then you see up there on the architrave, the triglyphs, which are the three, I don't know if you can see my arrow or not, but these three kind of vertical lines that we have repeated as a pattern. And then just really massive, heavy structure. All right, so this is a gorgeous building. You see the color, of course, is what draws the eye, but also look at the very top of the image. You see some vegetal design there. We see some geometric design in the shapes of the dome, and we see some calligraphy. So this is a piece of Islamic architecture. And quite gorgeous. And then this one's a fairly easy one because we see the Egyptian figures here in profile. This is an Egyptian temple. And here is a Byzantine building. In fact, this is the outside of the Hagia Sophia. Now, you see that it has minarets around it. So this is almost a trick question. This is a combo of Byzantine and Islamic architecture. We see the heavy domes that would have been Byzantine, but then later these minarets were added as the church became a mosque. Okay, I would now like to talk a little bit about early Christianity and Islam, and also provide an introduction for you as you prepare to do the literature activity that goes along with this week's lesson. Okay, so our topic in literature this week for humanities is relatively simple and easy to understand. I'm being a little bit sarcastic here. So just like when I talked briefly about the Ramayana, which is still currently a religious work, as well as something that we can read for its literary and humanities value, the works that we're going to look at this week or this module are similar. We'll read portions of the Christian New Testament. We're going to read the Gospel of John and Surah 24 from the Quran. My purpose in this part of the lecture is to introduce you to these works as literature. Many of you may be familiar with these works from a religious or theological standpoint. As we discuss these and as you fill out your chart, please understand that we will keep the focus on them as works of literature. Their narratives, their literary elements, their themes. It's when we stray into life application, like to personal application, that we kind of cross over from the academic subject of humanities and into theology, which we're not going to try to do here in this class. We also will very firmly, although we have entered it a little bit in the empire section, we will firmly leave BCE behind us and move to the Common Era. And my cat Florence is here helping me, so hopefully she won't be too loud. Okay. You are going to read a portion of the Gospel of John, the first chapter. So let's talk about it and some things that you may have not noticed about it, even if you are very familiar with this. I asked you to read the opening of the book of John, which is the fourth gospel, and one that is very different from the other gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Although most Christians, whether biblical scholars or not, have regarded the Apostle John, not John the Baptist, as the author, some nowadays wonder if the book was written later by one of John's associates from John's recollections. This would explain, according to this viewpoint, why the gospel seems out of step with the other gospels, the so-called synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke. The book was likely written between 70 and 100 CE in Ephesus, which was an important Asia Minor city during Roman times, and now would be located in modern-day Turkey. Those arguing for a different author than the Apostle John sets the date at the later end of that range, while those who would argue that it was the Apostle John or John the Evangelist, it occurred more towards the earlier part of this range. John's audience included both Jews and Gentiles or non-Jews in the wider world of the Roman Empire. How do we know this? Well, we know this because the book explains some of the Jewish customs that an entirely Jewish audience would never need it explained. So that's kind of what scholars have decided, I think the audience was mixed, and so that's why John is explaining some of these Jewish customs. In terms of literary features, John contains the typical subgenres of narratives found in Gospels. So Gospels are story that contains aspects of the life of Christ, but they also within those genres have some subgenres. So calling stories, and this would be like when Jesus is calling disciples, parables, which are stories told metaphorically, miracle stories, etc. John emphasizes expanded discourses, heavy with symbolism, as we see in this first chapter that we're going to read. Recurring motifs in John include the number 3, the number 7, the theme of misunderstood statements, and contrasts, so light and dark, love and hate, to name a few. There is some evidence that the opening lines of John, verses 1 and 2, were actually drawn from an early Christian hymn. We also see what's called the chiastic structure, present in Job, which you guys read a little bit of, but I didn't really get into in terms of my own lecture. So a chi, a chi, is the letter X, what we would call X, but in Greek it's called chi. In John chapter 1, we begin with the idea of the Word was with God, and we end with the idea that the Word was with the Father. At the center of the chi, or X, is the main idea, found in verses 12 and 13, that believers become the children of God. So whenever we have a chiastic structure, we look at what's in the middle of that chi. It's kind of like a little factory. You put in AB and you get out BA. It kind of flips it around. You see this as a rhetorical device, but we also see this in the Gospel of John. Okay, we briefly talked about Plato, and you guys watched a short cartoon video called Plato's Cave in the Greek World lecture a few modules back. And so Plato was very, very influential, not only through his own writings, but also through his student Aristotle. Even though Plato lived around 400 BCE, he still had a big influence around the time of the Gospel writings, which, as we saw, were in the 1st century CE, and also on the Greek philosophy of Stoicism, which many Romans also adhered to. We see many tie-ins, therefore, with Plato and Stoicism philosophical school in John's Gospel. Like Plato referencing Socrates, John presents himself as a beloved pupil, present at his master's last symposium. So Plato presents his writings as coming from his teacher Socrates, in the same way that John presents his gospel as the teachings of Jesus that he heard from Jesus's feet, in the same way that Plato received Socrates' wisdom. This link to Plato is borne out by the fact that the oldest surviving manuscripts of both John and Plato's Symposium were found together in Egypt, written on papyrus. 1st century CE Jews were definitely reading Plato, and early Christians were very interested in Plato's work, especially with his Apology and Phaedo, which deal with Socrates' trial and death. So Socrates, if you don't know, was forced to drink poison hemlock for quote-unquote corrupting the youth of Athens. So he kind of died a martyr's death. Plato had many, many beliefs, Some of them still capture our imagination today, like the cave analogy, while others, like those found in the Republic, are largely deemed of little use to modern society. But one of Plato's most main themes was his elevated idea of the ideal. So you saw that in Plato's cave, where we see only shadows of the reality that really is, and we are not able to see that unless we come out of the cave. Okay, this is an important idea in Western philosophy. What is more real, the actual flawed things that we see every day, the shadows on the wall of the cave, or the ideal versions of those things? Plato viewed God as an ideal, much more elevated than was traditional for ancient Greeks, whose gods, as you remember from a prior lecture, were not above acting just as immorally and capriciously as mortals. But how could an ideal God interact with his imperfect creation? Plato's answer was that there was a word that could communicate with God because of his own righteousness, but yet would be humble enough to interact with mankind. The Jewish thinker Philo expanded on this idea, calling the word God's firstborn. So we see John in his gospel drawing on the ideas already circulating in the secular world as a way to reach his audience of non-Jews in his gospel. Let's move on to the Quran. As when I briefly touched on the context of Christianity's birth as a religion, I will refer you to the crash course video for background information on how the Quran came into being and how Islam spread from its roots in Mecca and Medina on the Arabian Peninsula. Like the development of the New Testament text, you will find a lot of information about how the Quran came into being as a book in those crash course videos. And just as Christians view the works of the Old and New Testament to be God's word, Muslims believe the Quran to be God's word as revealed to the Prophet Muhammad via the angel Gabriel. The big difference between the Quran and the New Testaments involves both dating and authorship. The Quran was revealed over a much shorter period, just over 20 years between 610 and 632 CE, and was revealed to just one human author, quote unquote, or conduit, Muhammad. Muslim scholars, both Sunni and Shia, generally agree that Quran was written down after Muhammad's death. But please understand that Arabia of late antiquity was a predominantly oral society and that few people were able to read and write. And so the people of that time period would have been much more trained to listen and remember than we are today. Until recently, the Quran has not been seriously studied as a literary work, but fortunately this practice is changing. According to Mustansir Mir, most traditional Muslim scholars would not have considered the Quran to possess unity or coherence, but this view began to change in the late 20th century. Most previous discussion of the Quran's literary features was inseparable from theological considerations. So we're going to find ourselves in a road less traveled here when we look at the literary features of the Quran in Surah 24, which is wonderful for literary scholars, but kind of scary for non-experts and us in a general humanities course. There is no long tradition of scholarly commentary on the literary aspects of the Quran, but I'm going to introduce a few things to you as we read Surah 24. First off, the Quran is the first work of literature written in Arabic. Thus, it had a profound influence on that language's development. Due to the shortened time period of production, so to speak, or revelation, the Quran is shorter and not as varied in terms of genres represented as the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. For example, there are no lamentations or acrostic poems like you find in the Hebrew Bible. But we do see some key literary features in the Quran, including figures of speech, satire, irony, and similes. Its similes are particular to its setting in Arabia, but these similes can be understood by those who aren't native desert dwellers. You can see an example of Arabian similes in Surah 24. I'm not going to tell you what they are because you're supposed to read Surah 24 for the homework. A unique feature of the Quran is its rhymed prose, which is different than poetry. In Arabic culture in the 6th and 7th century CE, pure poetry was associated with untruthfulness. Therefore, though we do have sections of the Quran that rhyme in Arabic, these sections are categorized as rhymed prose due to the bad rap that poetry had. There are narrative sections in the Quran as there are in the holy books of the other Abrahamic religions, Judaism and Christianity. However, the Quran incorporates these narratives in the context of a didactic point. So, for example, the character Abraham appears in the Quran just like he appears in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. But he's scattered across several surahs or chapters in the Quran because the Quran is organized thematically instead of told all in one fell swoop as it is in the book of Genesis. So in the book of Genesis, all of everything about Abraham's life is consolidated into chapters that are adjacent to each other because the focus was on the narration. In the Quran, it's scattered all over the place because its focus is theme, and so it's organized thematically. These stories are used to drive home the point it happens to be making in a surah or in a section of it. The Quran also includes dramatic dialogues as an important genre. There is a division in the tone of the surahs depending on where Muhammad was when he received the word from Gabriel. The so-called Meccan surahs, which were roughly the beginning ones, CE 610 to 622, are the more poetic and rhetorical surahs, and the Medinan surahs are the more discursive and matter-of-fact. Surah 24 is a Medinan surah, so it's considered more practical. Although, to be honest, the parts that I included for you to read are not the real practical parts. Those come like before and after the part that I excerpted for you. I'm sorry that I don't have a lot of specific guidance for you here as you prepare to read the Surah 24. When scholars say there is a lack of academic discussion about the Quran as literature, they are absolutely right. I'm a pretty decent researcher, but most of the academic works I found were dissertations in the last 5 years. That's how new this field is. My searches in one database for both Surah 24 and Surah 26 yielded absolutely no results. I was shocked. I hope that in a few years' time this problem will be remedied. I don't know enough about the Quran myself to know which .org or .com websites to trust, and most of those searches pulled up theological interpretations. I'm choosing the Surah 24, Medinan Surah Light, for you guys to look at. Its Arabic name is An-Nur, which I have printed for you on the handout. It is considered to be a more practical surah because it is a Medinan surah. Again, I did not necessarily pull out the most practical parts of it. Surah 36, which I did not pull out for you, but just as by contrast, is a Meccan surah, and it's known as the heart of the Quran. Known as Yasin, which you can kind of translate as, O thou human being, but that's a very, very important surah, but not one that I pulled out here for you. If you're a Christian or a Muslim and you're reading the Bible and the Quran, you will find similarities between the two scriptures. Gabriel Said Reynolds argues that the Quran is in conversation with the canonical Bible, but also those post-biblical but pre-Quranic Jewish and Christian writings, which became part of the repertoire of sacred history among Jews and Christians. Just as John's Gospel was a product in conversation with its own time period's strains of thought, the Neoplatonism that was running around at the time, so the Quran engages with those earlier monotheistic religions. It is an original literary work in its own right, of course, and since there was no Arabic translation of either the Jewish or Christian Bible at the time, there's no way Muhammad could have drawn directly from those scriptures. There are also no direct quotations from the Bible and the Quran, although you will see some similar imagery. But there's no denying that several characters familiar to Jews and Christians make an appearance in the Quran, including Noah, Abraham, Joseph, the son of Jacob, so the one that was banished to Egypt, John the Baptist and his parents, although he's not called John the Baptist in the Quran, and Mary, mother of Christ. Reynolds postulates that about 1/4 of the Quran engages with these figures. Other similarities with the sacred works include the Quran's cosmology, so the idea of creation, its use of parables, the existence of prophets, and its discussion of legal matters. The residents of the Arabian Peninsula would have been familiar with Syriac Christians, a branch of Christianity focused on the Middle East and India and based historically in Iraq. So it's not like they were growing up in a vacuum and not encountering any other Abrahamic religions. Finally, I'd like to talk about the Islamic influence on Christian Europe. When the religion first began to spread, it spawned a reaction among some Christians in Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, or the seat of the Byzantine Empire at the time, to destroy religious icons. This is called iconoclasm. Islam takes the commandment to make no idols very seriously. This practice of destroying what was once considered holy is now known as iconoclasm, so you may see that term used and not about art. We also see Islamic influences in some early medieval Christian artwork. I'm showing a slide here of the Lindisfarne Gospel, which you also have in your textbook. I don't think it's this particular page, but you do have some pages or some images in your textbook. This is a beautifully illuminated manuscript of the Bible dating from the late 7th century CE, less than 100 years after the death of Muhammad. This art style of the decorated letters is called carpet page, after the beautiful Turkish carpets that used Islamic motifs of vegetal patterns based on flowers and plants and abstract patterns. We will continue to see Islamic influence on the West in literature, especially when it comes to something called the frame story, but also of the Spanish language, including some common words like algodón, cotton, loco, crazy, and ojalá. And if you look closely at the word, you see the word Allah, A-L-A, there, nestled in ojalá, which means I hope. That's all for now. Check out the resources section of this module for more details about the sources I consulted for this lecture.